Inside the Apostolic Palace of the Vatican on the night of October 30, 1503, something happened that shook the Christian world to its core. Under vaulted ceilings built to honor the divine, 50 naked courtesans crawled across the freezing marble floor. Cardinals and bishops stood frozen, their silence heavier than the air itself, and at the center of it all, watching, smiling, even laughing, sat Pope Alexander Vist. He presided over the scene like it was his own twisted celebration. But what the witnesses saw that night was only the opening scene. The true nightmare had not yet begun. What followed would be so depraved, so violently opposed to the very idea of sanctity, that even the most hardened chroniclers centuries later struggled to write it down without hesitation. This is the story of Lucrezia Borgia, a woman trapped in a dynasty where power mattered more than blood, faith, or human dignity. A woman whose wedding night became one of the darkest stains in Vatican history. If hidden horrors of the past fascinate you, subscribe to Grim History, hit the like button. And once you reach the moment that unsettles you most, tell me where you're watching from. Let's begin. In the autumn of 1503, the bells of St. Peter's rang across Rome carrying news that quickly consumed Italy. The Pope had announced that his daughter, twice widowed under circumstances dripping with suspicion, would marry once more. But this time there would be no distant palace, no quiet noble hall. The ceremony would take place inside the Vatican itself in the papal apartments beneath sacred fresco and symbols meant to represent heaven's judgment. The groom chosen for Lucrezia was Alfonso d'Este, the young heir to the powerful Duch of Ferrara. To the rest of Italy, this alliance looked like a political triumph. To Alfonso, it felt more like a quiet execution. Lucrezia's past was infamous. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, had run from Rome claiming assassins had been sent for him. Her second, Alfonso of Aragon, had been strangled on the steps of the Vatican Roma, pointing directly toward her brother, Cesare Borgia. And now, another Alfonso was being bound to the Borgia family. He knew the danger. Every noble in Italy did. Desperate to escape what he knew was coming, Alfonso tried everything. Diplomatic excuses, delays, pleas through emissaries. But Alexander VI was not a man who tolerated refusal. Inside the Vatican, surrounded by scarlet, robed cardinals, his command was absolute. Messengers rode day and night toward Ferrara with the simple message: accept this marriage or be destroyed. If the Este family resisted, Ferrara would face Caesar's merciless armies. Their dynasty could be shattered, and excommunication would strip them of both legitimacy and allies. Italy understood the truth well. No one survived a conflict with the Boers. Realizing resistance meant annihilation, Duke Eldest ordered his son to travel to Rome and surrender to the unavoidable alliance. Meanwhile, in her Vatican apartments, Lucrezia Borgia gazed out over the eternal city, her expression heavy with a sorrow far older than her 21 years. Europe had painted her as a seductress, a poisoner, a woman who manipulated men like chess pieces. But those closest to her knew the truth. She was not a mastermind of deceit, but a pawn trapped between a father and brother, whose ambitions knew no limits. Her first marriage was dissolved the moment it ceased to benefit them. Her second husband, whom she had genuinely loved, was murdered before her eyes, a fate she could neither prevent nor avenge. Her attendants whispered that she woke in the dead of night, clasping her chest, trembling from nightmares she refused to discuss. She knew this third marriage would not bring love, but even she could not imagine what her wedding night would become. Something dark, calculated, and cruel was gathering behind Vatican walls. Preparations for the ceremony moved quickly, yet the atmosphere inside the Apostolic Palace felt suffocating. Servants averted their eyes. Cardinals muttered in hushed tones. Strange figures passed through forbidden hallways at odd hours. Rumors swelled of secret instructions, of guests brought in through hidden passages. And one man felt the weight of it all more than anyone. Johann Bassard, the Vatican's master of ceremonies. He had seen countless scandals under Alexander VI's. Extravagant feasts, political bribes, sacred offices sold like trinkets. But something about this night sent a cold unease through him. He sensed that this event would eclipse every scandal he had ever recorded. He sensed that he was about to witness something history would struggle to speak of. A trap had been set, gilded, polished, and inescapable, and both bride and groom were already marching toward its center. In December, Alonso d'Este entered Rome with a small escort. His journey from Ferrara had dragged him through frozen mountains, battered roads, and a growing dread that settled heavily on his chest. But nothing prepared him for the sight of the Vatican, a stone colossus rising above the city, half bathed in candlelight, half lost in scaffolding. It looked less like the heart of Christianity, and more like a fortress built to swallow those who dared oppose it. Inside, the welcome was overwhelming. Alexander VI sat upon its throne, robed in shimmering white and gold that reflected the candlelight like molten metal. Beside him stood Caesar, silent, motionless, and terrifying in his restraint. Though only 26, he was already feared across Italy. Entire families vanished at his command. Cities surrendered at his approach. When his eyes locked onto Alfonso, the meaning was unmistakable. You are no guest here. Over the following weeks, Alfonso endured humiliation disguised as celebration. At banquets, he was seated beside courtesans while high-ranking clergy watched with thinly concealed amusement. On hunts, Caesar displayed a ruthless skill that felt more like a warning than sport. During receptions, Alexander VI made pointed remarks about the tragic ends of Lucrezia's previous husbands. Every gesture carried the same quiet threat. You belong to us now. And the worst part, the true horror of this wedding, the moment that history would whisper about for centuries, had not yet begun. There were hunts where Caesar displayed his dominance with cold, effortless precision, reminding Alonso with every arrow and every fallen beast that he commanded not only armies, but fear itself. There were receptions where Alexander mocked the fates of Lucrezia's previous husbands in front of the entire court, hinting almost cheerfully how short the life of a borough son-in-law tended to be. Alonso tried to preserve what remained of his dignity, but by then he was a prisoner wrapped in ceremony. His own nights were kept isolated in the Vatican, under flimsy excuses. He slept in rooms watched day and night by papal guards. Every passing hour revealed the truth more clearly. He had walked into a trap, and there was no path back out. The marriage was nothing but a facade. The real purpose was far more vicious. The Borgias intended to break the Este family's pride, humiliate them before Italy, and show every noble house from Florence to Naples that their will could crush any lineage, no matter how old or powerful. And while Alfonso endured this quiet psychological siege, preparations of a very different nature were unfolding deep within the Vatican. Caesar took personal command of the wedding night's feast, and his vision pushed far beyond what even Rome's most decadent circles would have dared to whisper aloud. Behind closed doors, he met with his father to finalize the details. Details that would have horrified any soul who still held the church in reverence. 50 of the most striking courtesans in Rome were hand-selected and taken into secret chambers beneath the palace. These were not ordinary prostitutes, but educated, refined women who frequented the salons of nobles. Many trembled when they learned what the Pope expected of them, yet none dared to defy the head of Christendom. They were ordered to dress in lavish velvet and silk garments they would later be compelled to remove. They were escorted through hidden passageways, led by lantern light, so that on the night of the wedding, they could be funneled into the papal apartments without warning. Servants who witnessed these preparations crossed themselves, repeatedly whispering prayers that clung to their lips like frost. They knew something unholy had begun to rise within the walls of the Vatican. Even Lucrezia sensed it. Though she was deliberately excluded from most preparations, she felt the dark tension thickening in the air. Her maids reported unfamiliar faces slipping through corridors, courtesans appearing in rooms where they did not belong, and her brother Caesar moving about with a smile that made their blood run cold. The night before the wedding, unable to endure the suffocating atmosphere, Lucrezia fled to the Sign Chapel. Beneath Michelangelo's vast, thunderous sky, beneath the painted hand of God reaching toward Adam, she collapsed to her knees. She prayed not for love or happiness, but for rescue, an intervention, a sign, anything at all. But the chapel remained silent. The divine felt impossibly distant. The candles flickered in the winter air, sneaking through ancient cracks as though straining to stay alive. Outside, the Vatican prepared for a celebration that would blur the line between sacred ritual and unspeakable corruption. In his chamber, Yen Burchard, the master of ceremonies, reviewed the final protocol. His hand trembled as he dipped his quill. He understood too well that what he was about to record would either be buried forever or stand as the most damning document in the history of the Church. The night of October 30th, 1503 was approaching, and with it a spectacle that would drag even the walls of the Vatican closer to hell. October 30 dawned with the grandeur of a papal wedding. The bells of St. Peter's echoed over the 7 hills of Rome. Crowds thronged the streets surrounding the Vatican, eager to glimpse the infamous bride. Inside the Apostolic Palace, Lucrezia was prepared by a dozen attendants. She wore a gown of shimmering silk embroidered with gold glowing like liquid flame beneath the candles. Her hair, long, bright, and carefully braided with pearls, fell down her shoulders in intricate plaits. Her face was pale, powdered to mask the exhaustion and fear beneath her eyes. When she looked into the mirror, she did not see a bride. She saw a sacrifice. The ceremony was held in the papal chapel, a chamber drowning in gilded walls and holy paintings. Alexander VI officiated personally, his booming voice filling the sacred space as he bound Alfonso and Lucrezia together before God. Rows of scarlet-clad cardinals stood rigidly along the chapel, their expressions carefully carved into masks of devotion. But behind their practiced piety flickered something else, dread. Every one of them knew the Borgia reputation. Every one of them sensed that what they witnessed today was only the prelude. After the ceremony, the guests were escorted to the Borgia apartments. Halls resplendent with fresco painted by Pintoio. Stories of saints, heroes, and myths stretching across walls now tainted by the debauchery that approached. Enormous tables overflowed with roasted boar. Pheasants still adorned in their feathers. Piles of exotic fruit and goblets of wine from the finest vineyards in Italy. Cardinals, Roman nobles, emissaries from Ferrara, and hand-picked courtiers filled the room. Alfonso and Lucrezia sat at the head table, trapped in a celebration that already felt unreal, like a masquerade masking something darker beneath. At first, the banquet unfolded like any noble feast. Gentle music from lutes and viols drifted through the air. Toasts were offered, hollow compliments exchanged, and polite diplomacy performed. But as the night deepened, the atmosphere shifted. Alexander, already flushed from heavy drinking, grew louder, more jubilant. Caesar, silent until then, slowly rose and delivered a subtle command with a tilt of his head. The massive doors slammed shut. Guards took their positions. No one would leave this room. What happened next tore through the last remaining boundary between decadence and depravity. At Caesar's signal, the side doors opened, and 50 courtesans stepped into the hall, draped in velvet and jewels, but unable to hide the terror in their eyes. A hush fell over the room, thick as smoke. Then Alexander rose from his throne, smiling as if unveiling a masterpiece, and announced that the true entertainment was about to begin. At Alexander's command, the courtesans began to strip themselves of every layer of silk and velvet, letting their dazzling garments slip to the marble floor until they stood completely naked before the assembly. A cathedral built for prayer now stared at a scene that felt torn from a blasphemous dream. Cardinals turned their heads away, their trembling fingers tracing frantic crosses over their chests. Some tried to rise and flee, but the guards at the doors shifted forward with hands resting on their swords, making it unmistakably clear that no one would escape this spectacle. Alfonso could only stare, his face frozen in a mask of disbelief and revulsion. Lucrezia sat beside him, petrified, her tears streaming silently, soaking into the silk of her wedding dress, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles blanched white. Then came the Pope's next order. The naked courtesans were commanded to dance between the long banquet tables. Servants lit towering candelabras, and the flames cast jagged shadows across the frescoed walls. The women moved through the flickering light like spectral figures, their silhouettes twisting across the holy paintings. Saints and angels watching silently as the Vatican devolved into a pagan ritual. But Alexander was only beginning. In an act crafted solely to degrade, he ordered baskets of chestnuts to be brought in and scattered across the polished marble floor. The nuts rolled between the feet of horrified guests, the sound echoing like faint thunder. Then, the Pope announced the next phase of his depravity. The courtesans were to crawl on all fours between the legs of cardinals and nobles to collect the chestnuts like animals driven into a grotesque contest. The woman who gathered the most would be rewarded with silk cloaks, gold jewelry, and treasures from the papal vault. The humiliation that followed was so extreme that Jan Burchard, hardened by years of witnessing the Vatican's darkest moments, later wrote that he struggled to describe it in words. 50 naked women crawled across the sacred Vatican floor between the robes of church princes, while Alexander and Kays watched from an elevated platform, laughing, pointing, and placing bets as if this were a cheap performance in a brothel, not the beating heart of Christendom. Some young cardinals, drunk and overwhelmed by the night's madness, laughed and cheered. Others bowed their heads, crushed by the war between their faith and their terror of the Pope. Alfonso sat motionless, unable to comprehend that this nightmare was part of his wedding feast in the Vatican itself, under the eyes of the man who claimed to speak for God. And Lucrezia, poor Lucrezia, her wedding dress had become a shroud. Her tears had dried into a frozen expression of emptiness. She had always known her father and brother were capable of monstrous things, but she had never imagined they would turn her wedding into a ritual of damnation. Yet even now the night had not reached its darkest point. As midnight approached and the Vatican clocks told 12, Alexander finally declared the end of the Chestnut Banquet. The naked courtesans, exhausted, huddled in corners with their humiliating prizes. Wine soaked the tables. Guests sat frozen, half-drunk, half-stunned, entirely broken. Alexander, however, was clear-headed, focused, intent, and his next command silenced the hall so completely that one could hear the candles crackle. With a voice dripping in authority, he announced that the sacred duty of marriage now had to be fulfilled. But what he ordered next crushed whatever remained of dignity in the room. He proclaimed that Alonso d'Este must prove the marriage with Lucrezia, not once, but 3 times, and not in private. Every witness present was to remain in place to verify that the union was sealed irrevocably before both the church and the world. The hall descended into horrified silence. Even Caesar, whose name was synonymous with brutality, looked sharply at his father, caught off guard by the sheer audacity of the decree. Alonso rose slowly, his face drained of all colour. He was a prince raised on ideals of honour and duty. But surrounded now by Caesar's armed men, their hands gripping their sword hilts, he understood there was no refusing this command. He turned to look at Lucrezia. She trembled like a bird trapped beneath a predator's shadow. Her eyes were vacant, her spirit already battered past the point of resistance. Her lips moved, but no sound escaped. Under the murderous gaze of the guards and the expectant stare of the Pope, Alfonso had no choice. He escorted Lucrezia toward an adjoining chamber, a room normally used for receiving diplomats, now transformed into a furnished bridal chamber. The doors remained wide open. No privacy, no humanity. Those who had not fled were forced to stand in the outer room, in full view of what was about to take place. What followed was not a union. It was the destruction of 2 human beings. Witnesses stared in stunned silence. Some whispered desperate prayers. Others cried quietly. Even the courtesans, victims of their own degradation, looked away in grief. And as the night dragged on, and the Pope's horrific order unfolded step by step, a single unspoken truth filled the Vatican. Something sacred had died in that palace, and Rome would never be the same again. By the time the night dragged into its final hours, Lydia had slipped into a state beyond exhaustion, beyond fear. Her mind, desperate to survive, had separated from the nightmare, unfolding around her. She moved mechanically without thought, as if her spirit had fled her body to escape the horror she could no longer fight. And then, just as the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows of the Borgia apartments, Pope Alexander VI issued the command for the third and final fulfillment of his monstrous decree. Josiah was present again, watching coldly, overseeing every detail with the same clinical detachment he used on the battlefield. When the ordeal was completed, he announced triumphantly that the marriage was now bound 3 times, sealed in the eyes of both the church and the law, impossible to challenge or undo. Alexander VI lifted his wine cup in satisfaction, smiling as if the night had been nothing more than an extravagant celebration instead of a descent into moral abyss. What remained in the room were the survivors, a collection of broken souls, cardinals who had entered the apartment draped in scarlet as servants of God, now stood as unwilling witnesses to an atrocity they could never confess. Their silence, their inaction had made them accomplices. When the sun rose fully over Rome, it revealed devastation. Empty wine jugs, chestnuts crushed into the marble floor, exhausted courtesans curled in corners, guards standing like statues, eyes downcast. In the adjoining chamber, Lucrezia lay completely still, staring upward as if the ceiling itself were miles away. Her body remained in the room, but her spirit was elsewhere, somewhere unreachable. Alfonso sat at the edge of the bed, trembling violently, his face buried in his hands. Nothing in his life, no battlefield, no political threat had ever shattered him like this night. There was no revenge powerful enough to restore what had been taken from him. Within days, he left Rome quietly, broken beyond repair, returning to Ferrara with a silence he would carry for the rest of his life. Not once did he ever speak of the night again. The story could not be contained. Word of the banquet spread like a plague. Whispers in Roman streets turned into murmurs across Italy, then erupted into reports sent to courts throughout Europe. Ambassadors wrote encoded letters. Priests spoke in veiled warnings. Nobles read the dispatches in stunned disbelief. The Venetian envoy famously wrote, "What happened in the Vatican surpasses even the darkest imaginations of ancient Rome." He declared that the Pope had disgraced not only his daughter, but the entire church. The Boers had been feared before, but now they were viewed as the very embodiment of corruption. In marketplaces and taverns, people lowered their voices when uttering their name, as if the family itself could hear their whispers. Across Europe, preachers seized the tale as proof of Rome's moral rot. Among them was a monk who would soon plunge the church into upheaval, Martin Luther. Years later, he would cite the Borgia feast as a symbol of everything poisoned within the Vatican. Meanwhile, Jan Burchard, the one man who had witnessed everything from beginning to end, recorded it all in his diary. His hands had trembled as he wrote, aware that his account might either vanish under Vatican secrecy or one day stand as the most damning testimony ever written about the Church. Lucrezia Borgia never escaped the shadow of that night. She moved to Ferrara with Alfonso and tried desperately to craft a normal life as a duchess. She funded charities. She protected artists. She nurtured literature and beauty. But those who saw her privately described the same thing: a lingering sorrow, a quiet melancholy, eyes that had seen too much. She bore children with Alfonso, but their marriage, irrevocably poisoned by that night, was a hollow shell. They lived side by side, but separated by a wound no human could mend. Lucrezia died young at 39, giving birth to her 8th child. On her deathbed, she asked for a priest and prayed until her final breath. Her last recorded words were, "I am ready to be free at last." Freedom, something she had been denied her entire life. Alexander VI died only months after the banquet rumors whispering the poison. The tool he had used so often had finally found its way back to him. Cesare Borgia, stripped of power after his father's death, fell in a lonely ambush in Spain. His body was mutilated and thrown into an unmarked grave, far from the grandeur he believed he was destined for. But the night of October 30th, 1503, did not die with them. It became a symbol, an icon of corruption, so severe that it fueled the flames of the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther and others invoked the Borgias repeatedly as proof of the Vatican's decay.